Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Neeru, and I'm a partner at the Boston Consulting Group based in our San Francisco office. I've been at BCG for almost a decade, and I focus primarily in our consumer practice. I lead our research on alternative proteins in North America. I'm joined by my colleague, Sara, who is a consultant at BCG in the Seattle office and primarily works in the climate and sustainability space. The work we'll be speaking about today was co-developed with multiple individuals across BCG and in collaboration with the Good Food Institute and Synthesis Capital. And we'll be sharing insights about what the alternative protein industry can learn from electric vehicles. As a brief introduction to BCG's work in alternative proteins, I want to share a few of the thought leadership articles that we have developed and which you might have come across. In our first paper published in 2021, we sized the total alternative protein market and developed growth projections. A key takeaway was that we predicted that the global alternative protein market would be worth $290 billion by 2035. Capturing 11% of the total global protein market. In our follow-up to that in 2022, we analyzed the climate opportunity, identifying this market growth has the potential to deliver 1 gigaton of carbon dioxide savings, which is worth about $50 to $80 billion in avoided emissions. We also highlighted that investing in the segment has the highest carbon dioxide savings per dollar of invested capital in any sector. In our report published last year, we discussed how we can live into this market and climate opportunity by winning with mainstream consumers and offered a 4-step solution leveraging detailed behavioral science research. Our 2024 report published earlier this year is about leveraging the learnings from the growth of the electric vehicle industry to drive further growth in the alternative protein sector, and that's what we'll focus on today. So you might be asking, why are electric vehicles and alternative proteins a relevant comparison? The parallels are actually quite striking, but obviously nuanced. First, both are key carbon abatement levers in their respective industries. Passenger road transportation accounts for about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions and animal agriculture for 15 to 20%. So whilst alternative proteins and electric vehicles are really important for their relative sectors, they obviously affect different industries, but they both bring about a series of chain reactions in transitioning multiple elements of that sector. For EVs, that includes automotive, energy, infrastructure, and building. And for alternative proteins, that includes food processing, agriculture, logistics, hospitality, etc. Second, they're both disruptive and promising technologies, but they both face challenges to their scaling. For electric vehicles, this has been about building out charging infrastructure. And for alternative proteins, this has been about scaling production capacity. Thirdly, both are consumer-facing products. So companies need to really deeply understand consumer drivers of choice. And the nuance here is that the consumption habits do differ a little bit between EVs and alternative proteins, as you might be aware. So food products are obviously lower cost items that are consumed daily, whereas electric vehicles are significantly more expensive and have a lower purchase frequency and trialability. On the consumer dimension, another commonality is that these both are rooted in culture and identity. So food is a social experience and it's an expression of cultural identity. And the choice of electric vehicles, on the other hand, could be perceived as an expression of status, of beliefs about the environment or about technology. Finally, both of these technologies have to take on powerful entrenched interests. And for EVs, this is large automakers in the energy sector. For alternative proteins, this is traditional meat and dairy players. So why should we be taking learnings from the electric vehicle industry? As we know, there's so much promise in alternative proteins, both from an environmental point of view to enhance food security, etc. But yet we're at 1% of meat dollar sales in US retail, and there have been challenges in gaining traction and winning over a mainstream audience. Electric vehicles, in comparison, have seen a similarly bumpy road since the early 2000s. However, the last couple of years have marked a turning point in the EV industry globally, growing from less than 0.2% of total new car sales in 2012 to 18% in 2023, according to IEA data. Given that they're much further ahead, there are some helpful learnings that we can take from their journey and apply to alternative proteins. We looked into the EV journey in depth and we distilled it into 3 key takeaways. The first is galvanizing private sector players to continue to meet and exceed consumer needs. The second is building a supportive public sector and strong policies that stimulate both supply and demand. And thirdly, directing investment from both the private and the public sector. We'll dive deeper into each of these and share both the electric vehicle and the alternative protein perspectives. The first lesson is that private sector players need to continue to meet and exceed consumer needs. There's 2 components of this. First, they need to deliver on the top needs of consumers to close the gap to parity and therefore drive sustainability as an and not an or. So from an electric vehicle perspective, to compete with internal combustion engine vehicles, EV makers have innovated on technology, range, model selection to close the gap to parity with those internal combustion engine vehicles. And so therefore, electric vehicles are no longer a trade-off that consumers have to sacrifice features that they love on their gas-powered cars. Alternative proteins can learn from electric vehicles by continuing to drive those technological step changes and accelerate the time to parity on key dimensions like price, taste, and texture. The second component is to surpass the consumer expectations, delivering features that even the traditional options don't have. For example, as opposed to a sustainability-centered narrative, Tesla has been focused on bringing the cost of ownership down below rival models, building out innovative autopilot technology, and creating superior digital software. Alternative proteins can learn from this example by building additional benefits on top of the traditional protein products. For example, more nutritious products that have enhanced fiber or micronutrient or protein content, new flavors that customers didn't even know they want or can actually access from the traditional products, or customizable options that address individual dietary needs, allergies, taste preferences in a way that traditional proteins just can't do. And with that, I'll turn it to Sara to walk us through lessons 2 and 3.
Thank you, Neeru. Our second lesson today is around the importance of supportive policies, and there are early signs that the alternative protein industry is gaining support on the regulatory front. For example, Singapore and Israel are both emerging as leaders in the alternative protein space. They have committed millions of dollars of funding into open access laboratory research, as well as the construction of shared laboratory spaces. Singapore is also at the forefront of developing regulatory guidelines for cultivated proteins, such as through streamlining the market approval process for new cultivated products. However, worldwide, there is still not enough regulatory support and investment into alternative proteins, and their funding struggles have been further compounded by the lobbying efforts of entrenched interests. So take Turkey, for instance, which placed a ban on vegan cheese in 2022. And closer to home, select states in the US are proposing bills to ban the sale of cultivated meats, or they're passing censorship laws around meat and dairy terms on alternative protein food labels. So to summarize, there is a need for continued government support to foster an equitable playing field, and we can look towards the electric vehicle industry to learn how most effective and supportive policies are structured. So this brings us to our second lesson. Countries like China and Norway have been early adopters of supportive electric vehicle policies, and today they are leaders in electric vehicle adoption and sales. A similarity between these two car markets is that their EV policy is structured around a similar four-step framework. One, setting ambitious national targets to stimulate the EV economy. So for example, the European Union has a target to sell exclusively zero emissions vehicles by 2035. Two, stimulating supply. China is a great example of this, with its dual subsidy policy that financially rewards automakers for producing EVs while penalizing those companies that do not meet their new electric vehicle quotas. Three, implementing demand-side enablers. For example, China, once again, has subsidies on the national, local, and manufacturing level that bring the price of an electric vehicle to a third of the original price. And China also has preferential license plate registration policies that make it easier to register electric vehicles over traditional cars. And four, addressing scale-up challenges around charging infrastructure and battery production. So for example, US's IIJA allocates around $7.5 billion in funding for public charging stations build-out. The lessons learned around EV policy design can inform how policy should be structured to accelerate the alternative protein transition. One, we need national targets that require the food industry to reduce its carbon footprint. Two, we need to increase supply through continuing to support open access scientific grants and commercializing products, thus bringing innovative alternative protein products from academic research settings to the consumer through local supermarkets and grocery stores. Three, we need to stimulate consumer demand by closing the gap to parity across taste, texture, availability, and price with conventional proteins, and also ensuring fair and competitive market conditions for alternative proteins, while giving consumers renewed confidence that these novel protein products are safe. And four, we need to address scale-up challenges through governments funding the build-out of more labs and production scale facilities. And we also need to reallocate agricultural subsidies to support the just transition of both farmers and food processing players from animal agriculture to growing ingredients and inputs needed for the alternative protein sector. The last lesson we will be talking about today is around investment. Globally, the animal agriculture sector contributes 15 to 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions, while passenger road transportation sector is only around 10%. However, electric vehicles have received almost 8 times the private funding of alternative proteins in the last 6 years. And this funding gap is likely even larger when we include non-private investment sources. And this is surprising given that a previous BCG publication showed that investing in alternative proteins has the highest CO2 emissions savings per dollar of invested capital of any sector, and it's nearly 4 times that of light road transportation. So in addition to increasing the overall volume of investment into alternative proteins, we can turn to the investment trends of electric vehicles to identify where this new funding should be allocated. There are 2 key points to highlight around the electric vehicle investment landscape today. One, investment is allocated across the entire end-to-end EV value chain, from raw materials all the way to EV charging. And 2, there is a diverse array of both public and private funding sources that EV makers can rely on today. Similarly, to build resilient supply chains for alternative proteins, we need to fill funding white spaces across the entire alternative protein ecosystem. This means expanding investment into value chains beyond research and production, which is where most funding is directed today. But it also means channeling funding into cultivated and fermentation-based alternative proteins that have historically received less funding than plant-based substitutes. Additionally, analyzing funding sources reveals that investment from industry, capital markets, and the government still lags venture capital funding when it comes to alternative proteins. So to summarize, we need to increase the overall volume of dollars, invest across the entire value chain, and ensure that alternative protein innovators can rely on diverse funding sources. I'll pass it back to Neeru to conclude the presentation.
In summary, there are 3 key takeaways from these lessons for different audiences. For incumbents and innovators, you need to continue to meet and surpass consumer expectations and innovate to stay ahead of the curve. Governments need to craft supportive public policy to act as a catalyst for alternative protein innovation and support the just transition of livestock farmers from animal agriculture. And investors need to continue to channel investment dollars across the entire value chain to reach a tipping point of adoption and continue to invest with that long-term mindset. We hope these insights have been helpful. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and please don't hesitate to reach out to Sara or I if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.